everyone. Hope you can hear me clearly. Welcome to our first podcast. Obviously I'm not with you this week, but I did want to record a lesson that you would find useful and also aid you in completing your next task. So, the aim of this lesson is to discuss the process around planning support for individuals. So we're really looking at task 2 of your assignment booklet, which we'll refer to in our next podcast. So hopefully by the end of this session you'll be able to identify the role of some key professionals involved in health and social care. You'll also be able to consider the cycle of assessment and planning support, and you'll also be able to discuss a range of factors that would be considered in planning support for individuals. So, we all think about and plan our lives in different ways, and that's quite an important point to consider when we are sometimes thinking about planning or structuring and recognising care planning for vulnerable people. Obviously this needs to be done in a more structured way than some of us live our daily lives. So the first main piece of legislation I wanted to introduce to you is the NHS Care in the Community Act 1990, which basically said that all local authorities are required to carry out needs-led assessments which should take into consideration individual preferences and choices. Now, a needs-led assessment is a person-centred assessment. So, whereby a resource-led assessment driven by things like availability of resources within particular areas, which can sometimes be a bit of a postcode lottery, because in some areas you may have access to certain types of provision, where in other areas you don't. So sometimes this is called a postcode lottery. So this NHS Care in the Community Act has tried to stop that from happening. So when planning support for an individual, it's important to decide what's important to them. So in your previous assignment you looked at things like the care value base, ensuring that people's rights were upheld, their right to choice. Okay, so we're just extending on that slightly. So during the assessment process, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, a social worker will discuss with the individual what their needs are, what may be working for them, what may not be working, but the overall goal is to ensure that individual has a good quality of life, and that quality of life isn't based on a resource-led approach. It's about the person. So, your first task, what I want you to do individually is just make a list of different things that you think, as a person completing an assessment, you would need to know about the individual who you are planning to support and to put a care plan in place. So what do you need to know about their life? Just take a moment to think about that and pause this presentation. And then once you're ready to continue, press play again. Okay, good. So hopefully you've looked at a range of different factors around an individual's life, and you may have come up with some things that relate to this slide here. So you may have come up with something like referral information that is given at the first stage of care planning, and it's often done by either other professionals referring to get support from an agency, or a self-referral from an individual who's recognised that they've got a care need. You may have also included some information around living arrangements. So that could be type of family that the individual lives in, their housing situation, so things like whether the house is overcrowded or undercrowded. Health information, so pre-existing conditions, what health related services are already involved, what if they're on any sort of existing medication. Social relationships may have been an area that you considered. This could be, again, referring back to the type of family, so whether it's a nuclear family, reconstructed family, or an extended family type, or it could have been more around significant others in the household. So is that person married, widowed, living with a partner? You may have also considered that you might need some past information when assessing an individual. Now, this past information could be past histories of service use. It could be things like past medical history. It could be past history of service use of family members. Just something to sort of create more of a background to that individual's life and that individual's previous access to any services. You may have also identified education or employment, or both, as factors that you'd want to discuss within your assessment, and also the neighbourhood where the individual lives. Is it a deprived area? Is it an affluent area? Also, what are the social relationships like with neighbours? Is there an extended care network that that individual has access to within their neighbourhood and their community? Or is the individual quite isolated? And also you may want to consider things that affect the individual's lifestyle. So dietary factors, whether they use alcohol or any other substances, whether they smoke, the impact of these lifestyle choices and factors on that individual's well-being. So well done for considering some of these. Now, your next task is we're going to start to think about the cycle of assessment and the cycle of planning support. So what I want you to do is, using these stages, so communication, referral, recording, holistic assessment, care planning, current provision, reviewing, evaluating, implementation and monitoring, I want you to try and come up with an order that you feel these should go in. So just pause the presentation for a moment and press play once you've completed this. Okay, thanks for having a go at that. So, the actual order of a care planning process starts with the referral. It then quickly moves on to the holistic assessment and identifying any current provision already in place. You then begin your care planning process, you record your care plan, then that will be communicated to the individual and then implemented. Once your plan's been implemented, you would then monitor the progress of that care plan, and then if there are areas that weren't working, you would review that, and then you would evaluate your care plan to see how successful it's been. So just to give you a bit more detail around these, referrals are the first stage in the care planning cycle, and these can be from a professional, or they can be a self-referral, as we said earlier. Now the next stage, holistic assessment, is something that some of you have had issues with in class. Holistic means the whole person. So a holistic assessment is an assessment of the needs and preferences undertaken by the care plan manager, so whoever's completing the care plan and whoever's completing the assessment. So they use different assessment tools, which will be given to you on a separate handout to accompany this lesson, and this holistic assessment will be done working closely with the individual that requires the services. So identifying current provision is looking at what resources are required to meet the individual's needs, and also what resources are already in place. So if you've got services or support around a particular issue already, there is absolutely no point duplicating that process. So you would then be able to create a picture of support from looking what's already in place, and that would feed into your care plan, which is the next stage. So this is basically where you identify some realistic targets to be achieved in supporting that individual. Now, these need to be providing appropriate care, and it needs to be appropriate goals to the individual, so things that they want to work towards, along with appropriate support from professionals. So when target setting, it's important to use something called SMART targets. Now, you may have heard of these before. Basically, these are very measurable targets. So the specific, measurable, achievable, recorded and timely. That's what SMART stands for. So your next process is recording. The care plan manager documents who's involved in the care plan. So pulls together all the different agencies and says who will do what. And this includes the individual themselves, their family, if neighbours are involved, as well as it being solely about professionals. So everybody's role in supporting that individual is recorded. So communicating is basically where the care plan manager ensures that everyone involved in that receives a copy of the care plan, understands their responsibilities, understands their roles, and then everybody is clear on how they are going to support that individual. And then it's time to implement your plan. So it's time to get that support in place. So the care plan manager, in consultation with the individual, will explain when services will be made available and what services are in place to support them. And then the plan will be monitored, so the care plan manager discusses with the individual who needs the support and anyone else that's involved in that plan what's working well, and identifies things that may need to change. So your next step is reviewing. So the care plan manager again reviews the provision of the care that the individual is receiving, and this is done alongside the individual with other stakeholders like neighbours, like we said earlier, along with professionals, and identifies new goals and new targets, and alters the care plan appropriately if it needs altering, to ensure that the individual is supported and that the individual's targets are being met. And the final stage in this cycle is evaluation. So the care plan manager and the individual decide a date to analyse and evaluate the success of the care plan. So to look at sort of distance travelled almost, of how well the individual has been supported, how independent that individual may have become, what significant changes have been made to that individual's life. So that, in a nutshell, is a summary of the care planning process. So that, along with considering the types of assessment, which you're going to get handouts on, and also a separate podcast like this, should be enough information for you to gain P1. So, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the second part of P1, where you need to think about what sort of assessment tools professionals may use after considering the cycle and the process that underpins assessment. Here is a list. This will also be provided to you as a handout. Should be on Moodle, available to you. So there's checklists, there's forms, there's the diary of a professional, a diary of a service user, questions, records of incidents and accidents, there's observations, personal histories, flow charts and discussions. Now, in considering these in your task, you will need to produce an information booklet for a new social work assistant which identifies the processes and assessment tools that would be used when planning support. So we've already looked at the assessment process. So the referral to evaluation cycle that takes place. But you will also need to consider these types of assessment tools which may be appropriate to your individual. So what I want you to do is just take a few moments to work through the case studies that you used in task 1, use them again, and just think about which of these assessment tools would fit in, or which of these assessment tools you identified as being useful for that first task. Then pause the presentation, and then when you're ready to continue with this, press play. So I hope you found that useful. Thanks for completing that exercise. Now, in completing P2, you do need to discuss a range of assessment tools and state how each of these would be used in your case. So if I were you, I'd probably discuss 3 for each of your cases, and that should give you 3 different ones for each of your cases. It should be clear, and that should give you enough of a broad coverage in your discussions around how you are going to use different assessment tools to meet the needs of different individuals. But I would also like you to give specific examples of how each of those fit into assessing each of the individuals that you're going to discuss for P2. Okay, just to summarise P2 then, just to make sure that everyone's absolutely clear before we move on to our merit and distinction points. What I want you to do is provide 2 case studies. These can be the case studies that you used in P1. I want you to discuss all the stages of the assessment process. So from receiving referral all the way to providing an evaluation of a care plan. Listen to this podcast in again if you need to, because all the stages were discussed earlier. And then I also want you to discuss different forms of assessment tools that would fit into your case studies. Ideally, I'd like to see 3 for each of your case studies, 3 different ones for each of your case studies, so you're covering 6 in total. And again, the sorts of detail that's required when discussing the different types of assessment tool and the sorts of information that you get from that assessment tool are covered in the handout that accompanies this video cast. So hopefully you're quite clear about what you'll need to do for P2. So that's everything that you need to know for P2, hopefully, which leads us nicely on to M2, in which you need to identify a range of key professionals that would work with individuals in need and their families. So what I want you to do now is just take a moment to pause this presentation and just come up with a list of as many key professionals as you can think of that may be involved in the support of individuals. Once you're ready to start again, please press play. Okay, thanks for taking the time to complete that task. Hopefully you've managed to identify a range of professionals from across both health and social care. But just to give you some ideas of who may support individuals and their families, it may be a social worker, it may be a health visitor, maybe a family support worker, there may be some form of justice worker involved, so whether that's the probation service or the youth offending team, also health services, the general practitioners, and there may be specialist nurses involved. The support of professionals to individuals and their families can be quite extensive. So hopefully you'll be able to identify a range of key professionals, and in doing that I'd like you to give a brief description around what the role of these professionals is. So for this task I'd like you to identify the role of 3 key professionals that would work with individuals and their families. So that is what's required of you for M2. So just to make sure that we are absolutely clear about what needs to be done for M2, you need to extend the booklet that you've provided, where you've provided your descriptions and your different assessment tools for P2, to consider a new point now, where you need to describe 3 different key professionals from across both health and social care. So it may be that you discuss the role of a social worker, you discuss the role of a specialist nurse, you discuss the role of a general practitioner in providing support to individuals and their families. You should also state how these professionals would work together to support each of the 2 individuals in your case studies. So you're extending your discussion to say how the key professionals would work together to support that individual and their needs. So we're thinking about things like multi-agency working on this point, and saying about ideas around holistic care, so providing care for the whole individual. So these are ideas that you touched on in your first task, and hopefully you should be able to transfer that knowledge that you gained earlier in the module to this M2 point. So for your final section on your task 2, you need to consider potential issues which could arise from professionals working together. You need to consider possible difficulties and discuss and evaluate these in relation to one of the 2 individuals in your case studies. So, in considering potential issues around professionals working together, there may be a range of areas that you want to discuss. Earlier in the presentation we discussed ideas around resource-led and person-centred assessment based on the Community Care Act 1990. So that idea around balancing services and resources might be something that you wish to explore further. And you may wish to consider conflicts of interest between individuals within different services, along with the individual who's being supported and the organisation that's supporting them. It could be an older person who's a wheelchair user, living in a residential home, who's a heavy smoker and unable to give the habit, but is unable to adhere to or is struggling with the legal requirement that he can't actually smoke in the care home. I know a lot of you have already looked at the Victoria Quimbier case and Baby P. Now, these cases highlighted a number of potential issues and problems in multi-agency working, particularly around communication and information sharing. And these issues may be something that you wish to explore further also. So what I want you to do now is pause the presentation in a moment and complete a research task. I want you to research into the case of Victoria Quimbier and the subsequent report around that, and have a look at what potential problems of multi-agency working were identified in that particular case. Once you've done this, press play again and we'll just summarise your D2 points. So hopefully you've managed to look at the Victoria Quimbier case and identified some of the issues that were identified there in terms of multi-agency working and some of the problems that can and often do materialise. So for D2, you need to continue your assignment and add a subsequent chapter that will assess just 2 potential issues which could arise from professionals working together. So you need to consider possible difficulties, whether that's around resources or delivering services, conflicts of interest. It could be conflict between 2 different organisations' professional values, such as If your case was a young offender, and you've got the youth offending team who are very justice focused and working in partnership with social services who are very care focused, then the approach to supporting that individual between the two agencies will be very different. Social services will be very much around dealing with welfare issues, whereas the youth offending team will be very much around ensuring that the young person completes their court order and ensuring that they adhere to the letter of that court order. Once you've discussed these potential difficulties, they only need to be in relation to one of your case studies, not both. So it's two potential issues in terms of problems for professionals working together in relation to one of your case studies. Well, I hope you found this useful and interesting. It's been a pleasure producing it for you, and I think potentially this is something that we could look at producing more of, particularly for my modules. I guess that all that's left to say really is that task 2, which this presentation has been around supporting you for, needs to be submitted on a week commencing Monday the 22nd of April. So that week I will see each of your groups, and I want this task in basically at the end of the day that I see you. Okay, good luck. Hopefully you've got enough information to produce this, and I look forward to receiving it. Thanks very much. Bye.